Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Reaper Minis TV. We're going to jump right into a new set of reviews this time, and first off we have 4 Goblin Pyros from the Pathfinder line, and in this blister you get 4 unique sculpts, and they're done in the same style as the previous Pathfinder Goblins, so they have big heads and big eyes and big floppy ears, and they look a little bit cartoony, but not overly so. And I still like this sculpting style, or the look of these goblins, more than just about any other goblins I've seen recently. So for me, they're perfect. They each carry a heavy serrated blade, and also they have a torch in their other hand. And if you weren't going to use them for pyromaniacs like they would be in Pathfinder, they'd be perfectly suitable for just goblins running around with a torch in one hand and a sword in the other. Each model did need a little bit of cleaning. They all had a little bit of flash here and there, and there were some faint mold lines, but nothing that took too long to clean up. These are going to make a perfect addition to the growing band of goblins and orcs that I'm building for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. They'd be great in D&D, obviously Pathfinder, and you could combine these with the earlier set of Pathfinder goblins if you wanted to create a large unit of goblins for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, or you could drop them into a Warlord Revan army with no problem at all. Next up is another Pathfinder goblin, and this is a female goblin war chanter. So I'm thinking some kind of spellcaster, maybe a cleric. I also thought that she might make a good goblin warlord if you wanted to use something like that in D&D, where she's kind of whipping everybody into a frenzy and spurring them on in the combat. She's carrying a long whip or scourge in one hand, and it's got barbed ends at the end of the whip itself, and a short sword or dagger in her other hand, and she's sculpted in a similar style and look as all the other Pathfinder goblins, so she's going to fit in perfectly with any of the other Pathfinder ones. And on the back of the model, her hair is tied up into 3 different pigtails, so a little bit of cute factor there until you turn her around and see that her face is just ugly as sin, but that's the intent. Her mouth is open wide, and as a war chanter, looks like she's yelling orders or casting some kind of spell with a verbal component there. But she was definitely not put in charge for her good looks, unless ugly as sin equals pretty in Goblin Society. Cleanup was about the same as with the other Goblin models, so a little bit of flash here and there and some slight mold lines. There's also a point at the base of her left foot that you'll need to clip off because it attaches from the bottom of her foot down to the casting tab itself. And there's one last thing that I just could not get out of my head after looking at this model for a little while. It just looks like the way that the whip is sculpted and how it connects down to the short sword, it just, to me, looks like she's got a big jump rope and she's jumping rope with one foot coming up in the air. And I don't know, maybe it's just me. Maybe you don't see that, but to me it just looks like it, and I get a little bit of a chuckle out of it. But I think she'd be great in any kind of tabletop army as a goblin spellcaster or even unit leader, and obviously in D&D or Pathfinder or whatever kind of fantasy role-playing game as the leader of a goblin warband. So, good model here. Okay, we're back into some Dark Heaven Legends miniatures to look at now, and the first one is the Brain Horror, and you might remember this from the Dungeon Horrors set that we looked at not too long ago. The Brain Horror has now been released on its own, and it comes in 4 pieces, so you have a little bit of assembly. There's 2 large tentacles that fit on the side of the model. Each one needed a little bit of cleaning. There was a visible mold line. And then the brain itself is a separate piece that glues down on top of the lower jaw and spinal column section. Now the bottom part of the model is made up of the spinal column, and you can see the bony sections, and it also has several tentacles, and it sort of pulls itself or crawls along on the tentacles. The brain is obviously quite oversized, so it's some kind of mutated creature. The jaw and the teeth and inside the mouth you can see a large tongue, also oversized along with the oversized spinal column, so some kind of aberration or mutated creature here. I think it'd be perfect in a Call of Cthulhu game, even in a Warhammer Fantasy game. Obviously, if you're a D&D player, you're going to see it as an intellect devourer, so lots of uses here in a couple of different games. I could even see maybe using it in a superhero game as some kind of alien brain that the heroes are fighting against. So, cleanup not too long, assembly very easy, and I think it'd paint up to look really cool. Very nice model here, I like it a lot. Next up is a blister pack that contains 3 classic sculpts, so these are older Dark Heaven Legends sculpts, and here we have 3 ghosts. And the first thing that I thought to use them for was part of a spirit host in a Vampire Counts army for Warhammer Fantasy Battle. In each of the 3 of them, you can see some kind of remnant of their skeletal structure. You can see the spinal column on them all, and you can see their skulls and some of the bony arms, and they all have a wispy or flowing kind of effect to their cloaks or what would be their clothes. I think they'd paint up easily with a dry brush and maybe a wash of a different color to give them a little bit of a spectral sense. Like I said, I'm going to use them for a spectral host or ghosts in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but there's no reason you couldn't use them just as individual ghosts in any kind of fantasy role-playing game. Each needed a little bit of cleaning. There was some flash here and there and a few very faint mold lines, but nothing too bad, and they're pretty much ready to be primed in just a couple of minutes after coming out of the package. Alright, and speaking of spectral minions or ghost-like miniatures, next we have a Banshee, and this is a single miniature that is a more recent sculpt than the three we just looked at, and she's also in a little more of a dynamic pose where she looks like she's floating off of the ground and turning around a little bit. For me, and you probably guessed this, spectral host for Vampire Count's army is where she's going to end up for me, but she'd also be fine on her own on a single base and just used as a single banshee or ghost or any kind of ethereal undead. But I think you could also use her in a superhero game the same way as the two female superheroes we looked at in a previous episode. She doesn't have anything that just outright says undead or ghost like the others have the skeletal structure showing. She could be used as a flying superheroine or supervillainous kind of model. I think she'd be good for that too. Okay, next up we have a couple of Warlord blisters, and the first one is a pack of Stone Zealots, and these little guys are part of the Bloodstone Gnomes faction in Warlord, and each of these little guys looks like a small elemental. He's about the size of a Snotling in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, or about half or a third the size of a Goblin for D&D players. And they're each carrying a large stone that has some carvings on it, and it's lashed or tied to their upper torso for them to carry around. And if you don't have a need for them in a Bloodstone Gnomes army for Warlord, I think they'd make pretty ideal familiars for some kind of spellcaster, whether it's in Warhammer Fantasy Battle or D&D or something like that where you have a familiar. I think they'd be pretty good in that role. Next in the Warlord blisters is a Sea Hag, and she comes from the Razig faction, and they're basically undead pirates, so you have zombies and skeleton pirates running around, and now there's a Sea Hag with them. And the first thing that I thought of when I saw the model was not immediately Sea Hag, but some kind of degenerate vampire, like a Nosferatu kind of vampire is what came out in my mind first. But it's listed as a Sea Hag, so as a hag or some kind of evil spellcaster is the intended use. There is a small octopus that's resting on the upper part of the left arm. It's a little hard to make out, but once it's primed, you should be able to pick it out pretty easily when you're painting it. She has webbed fingers and toes that end in sharp claws. Definitely a monstrous looking creature, but also quite humanoid also. She has pointy ears, and a nice added detail is she's a little bit hunched over, and you can see the outline of her spine coming sort of through the back of her shirt, so a nice added detail there. Cleaning was limited to a little bit of flash and barely visible mold lines in a couple places on the model, but nothing too difficult to take care of and get her based and primed in just a couple of minutes. The last figure for us to look at this time around is a rather hefty piece from the Chronoscope line, and the Slig Thrall unit is a single piece model where you have a little guy who's resting on a sort of mechanism that's riding on the back of a great big guy, and the great big guy has a large gun that he's firing, and he's really the star, in my opinion, of the model. He's got these cool goggles on, and he's got a roar sort of coming out of his mouth, and he's striding forward, just blazing away. The little guy on top has a pistol in one hand, and he's sort of, with his right hand, controlling or driving the big guy forward. I'm not sure if he has some kind of control over him or what, but his right hand is on some kind of lever or gear mechanism. The little guy on top has a very reptilian appearance to him, so he looks like a sci-fi kobold, and the bottom guy, or the large guy who's carrying the big gun, is definitely passable as an orc for 40k players, and I think this model would make a very unique leader type model in an orc 40k army. The only problem I had with the model is the pistol that's held in the left hand of the little guy. It's at sort of a weak joint, and I ended up breaking it after messing around with it for a while. I got it to glue back just fine, but just be aware that is going to be a potential problem, something you might need to repair or be careful with if you pick up the model. Okay, that's all we have time for right now. We'll see you in the next episode of Reaper Minis TV. Thanks for watching.